Trump said he would rather have CUSMA expire immediately. 9 days later, on July 1st, the U.S. officially declined to renew it. The deal that governs $2.5 trillion in continental trade is now on a rolling annual review, meaning every 12 months, the entire framework is up for pressure, revision, or threat. Canada's exports to the U.S. are still worth nearly $1 trillion a year. And yet, Mark Carney just told the world that Canada's decades-long deepening of ties with America is now over. What happens to 72% of your exports when the buyer stops signing contracts? If that question keeps you up at night, hit subscribe to Capital Alert right now and stay with this. Let's start with what actually happened on July 1st, 2026, because most people got it wrong. The headlines said CUSMA was rejected. That is not precisely what occurred here. What occurred is that Washington chose not to renew it for the automatic 16-year extension. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer issued a formal statement that same day, July 1st. The United States did not agree to renew the USMCA in its current form, Greer said plainly. He added that Washington would continue to engage with Mexico and Canada to address the agreement's shortcomings. Those two sentences, read together, tell you everything about Washington's negotiating posture. It is not termination, it is leverage. It is pressure with a deadline built into it every year. Because the U.S. chose not to renew, an annual review process kicks in for the next decade. CUSMA remains in force unless one partner gives 6 months' notice of withdrawal. So the deal exists, the framework is intact, but the certainty that surrounded it is gone. And in trade, certainty is not a soft concept. It is the foundation of every investment decision. The Globe and Mail reported that uncertainty about U.S. market access is already strangling business investment. A manufacturer in Ontario cannot commit to a 10-year expansion plan under annual review conditions. A steel buyer in Ohio cannot lock in Canadian supply contracts if tariffs could shift each year. That uncertainty cost is real, measurable, and accumulating on both sides of the border daily. Now understand the scale of what is actually at stake beneath the political theater here. According to Statistics Canada data for 2025, Canada exported 73% of its goods to the United States. Canada exported over 3/4 of its goods to the United States and imported almost half of its goods back. U.S. goods trade with Canada totaled an estimated $719.5 billion in 2025 alone. That is not a trade relationship. That is economic codependency built over 30 years of integration. And it did not happen by accident. It happened because NAFTA, then CUSMA, made it rational. Integrated supply chains, zero tariffs, seamless border crossings. The economics pointed one direction. Canada's auto sector, energy sector, agriculture, and steel all oriented themselves toward the U.S. market. The entire economic infrastructure of modern Canada was built around American market access being stable. Canada is the largest supplier of U.S. energy imports, including crude oil, natural gas, and electricity. Canada was responsible for a record 60.88% of U.S. oil imports in 2025. That figure, 60% of all American oil imports from a single country, is a staggering dependency, but it runs both ways. Canada depends on the U.S. market. The U.S. depends on Canadian supply. Trump knows the economic pain of CUSMA collapse falls harder on Canada than on the United States. Canada sells 73% of its goods to one buyer. The U.S. has dozens of alternative suppliers globally. That asymmetry is the core of Washington's leverage, and Ottawa has understood this for over a year, which is why Mark Carney's response to July 1st was not panic. It was a pre-built strategic pivot. Carney laid out his intention to double Canada's non-U.S. trade over the next decade. Last year, Canada's non-U.S. trade amounted to $300 billion. The target is $600 billion. And Carney did not wait for July 1st to start building toward that number. He started immediately after taking office. Carney spent 68 days abroad in his first year, visiting 26 countries to fulfill his trade diversification promise. That pace is extraordinary for any national leader, let alone one managing an active trade war simultaneously. Canada's exports to the U.S. decreased from 76% to 72% in 2025, with exports to other regions rising. That 4-point shift in 1 year sounds small, but on a base of nearly $1 trillion, it is not. The Canada-EU CETA agreement has boosted Canada-EU trade by 65% within 7 years of signing. That is the compound effect of a well-structured trade agreement operating over time with stability behind it. In January 2026, Canada announced a strategic economic partnership with China, cutting canola tariffs from roughly 85% to 15%. That single move unlocked nearly $3 billion Canadian dollars in near-term export orders almost immediately. These are not symbolic diplomatic gestures. These are real dollar flows redirected away from U.S. dependency. And the ambition goes even further than bilateral deals. Canada is now building coalition-level trade architecture. Carney is leading discussions to link the European Union with the 12-nation CPTPP Indo-Pacific bloc. The proposed alliance would create a massive trading bloc of nearly 1.5 billion people combined. Canada is reportedly leading that initiative after Carney urged middle powers to resist trade war pressure. This is not Canada playing defense. This is Canada attempting to redesign the global trade board entirely. The strategy has a name in Ottawa policy circles: variable geometry, flexible coalitions for a fragmented world. The concept represents an alliance among Canada, the 27-member EU, and the 12-nation Indo-Pacific bloc now under negotiation. But building a new trade architecture takes years. The pressure from Washington is arriving in months. Businesses must now consider the possibility of recurring negotiations, tariff disputes, and rule changes under annual CUSMA reviews. Scott Lynchacombe of the Cato Institute noted that uncertainty could dampen business investment even with CUSMA technically intact. That is the core tension Canada is managing right now, the long game versus the immediate economic pain. Building $600 billion in non-U.S. trade is the right strategic direction. But it does not help Hamilton steelworkers today. It does not help Ontario automakers sitting on pause while Washington decides what it wants from renegotiation. The July 1st non-renewal was expected. Carney himself said on June 30th he was not expecting any drama. Carney told reporters he expected a constructive exchange and was not looking for his pen to sign anything. That measured tone was deliberate. Ottawa did not want Canadian businesses to read July 1st as a crisis moment. But behind that calm messaging, the diplomatic machinery was already running at maximum capacity globally. Continental free trade has not ended, but businesses now face the possibility of recurring negotiations, tariff disputes, and rule changes under annual CUSMA reviews. That distinction carries enormous weight for every boardroom making capital commitments in North America right now. The calm surface of the July 1st outcome masks something deeper and more consequential beneath it. Washington did not just decline to extend a trade agreement. It chose uncertainty as its negotiating instrument. And Canada's answer to that instrument is being assembled in real time across 3 continents simultaneously. Start with Europe, because the numbers there are already proving the strategy works with real data. Since CETA's provisional application started in 2017, two-way trade in goods has surged by over 75%, and bilateral trade in services has grown by 97%. In 2024, Canada exported $34 billion to the EU, an increase of 57% from pre-CTA trade levels in 2015. In 2024, EU-Canada trade in goods and services reached around 125 billion euros combined across both sides. The EU is now Canada's second-largest trading partner, behind only the United States. That position, second largest, was not predetermined. It was built through deliberate trade architecture over years. Export Development Canada's regional vice president for Europe said they have been flooded with calls from companies looking to diversify into new markets. In the current environment, Canadian companies have realized that diversifying their export markets is no longer just a nice-to-have, he said directly. That shift in corporate psychology is one of the most significant things happening in Canadian trade right now. For 3 decades, the default assumption was, sell to America first, everywhere else is a bonus market. That assumption is now functionally broken, and Canadian businesses are responding faster than governments can legislate. Small and medium-sized enterprises exporting to Canada from the EU grew by approximately 20% following CETA's implementation. That SME participation data matters because it shows trade diversification is not just a large corporation strategy. Mid-sized Canadian producers of food, machinery, and specialty goods are finding EU buyers through CTA channels. The agreement eliminated 99% of tariff lines, giving Canadian exporters access to 450 million affluent consumers. That is a market of comparable size to the United States, structured differently, but now increasingly accessible at low cost. And Canada is not stopping at CETA. The Indo-Pacific pivot is running at the same time with equal urgency. Since CPTPP entered into force in 2019, Canada's merchandise trade has increased 42.9%, with the 7 CPTPP Indo-Pacific markets. The CPTPP covers 495 million consumers and 13.5% of global GDP across 11 member countries in Asia-Pacific. Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy, sits inside that agreement and represents Canada's largest bilateral Asian relationship. Canada and Japan are the 2 largest economies within the CPTPP structure, giving Ottawa real institutional influence inside the bloc. Canada's non-U.S. exports in goods and services reached $296 billion in 2024, already surpassing the government's own diversification target of $292 billion by 2025. That target was set years ago. The fact that Canada hit it early under active trade war conditions is not trivial. It means the diversification strategy was already gaining traction before July 1st made it an emergency policy priority. Now Carney is accelerating it. The EU CPTPP alliance concept is the most ambitious piece of that acceleration. The proposed alliance aims to create a massive trading bloc of nearly 1.5 billion people combined, linking Europe with the Indo-Pacific. At the G20 in Johannesburg in November 2025, Carney met with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Vietnam's Prime Minister to discuss deeper integration between CPTPP and the EU. By February 2026, Politico reported that an EU CPTPP alliance idea was now under active negotiation, with Canada spearheading the talks. This is a structural play. Canada is not just finding new customers. It is engineering a new multilateral framework. Carney's strategy relies on the collective strength of nations that often find themselves caught between superpowers. The logic is straightforward. If no single middle power can resist American trade pressure alone, build a coalition. A bloc of 1.5 billion consumers linked by rules-based trade agreements carries a weight Washington cannot simply dismiss. And Canada is positioning itself as the connector, the country that bridges the EU and the Indo-Pacific together. That is an extraordinary geopolitical ambition for a nation of 40 million people navigating a trade war simultaneously. But Carney's background as a former central banker, Bank of Canada, then Bank of England, shapes this instinct. He understands that institutional architecture, built carefully over time, generates compounding returns for those who design it. The EU CPTPP framework, if it coalesces, would give Canada preferential influence in both blocs simultaneously. The EU-Canada Joint Committee welcomed increased cooperation between the EU and CPTPP parties, covering digital trade, supply chain resilience, and trade diversification. That language, supply chain resilience, is the key phrase. It signals these discussions are being driven by structural necessity. Both Europe and the Indo-Pacific nations are managing their own exposure to American trade unpredictability right now. Canada is not the only one looking for alternatives. It is simply the one actively building the coalition framework. Canada has simultaneously pursued trade agreements, investment treaties, and sector-specific contracts across South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. The CPTPP and CETA came from earlier governments and took years. What is different now is the pace. That pace difference is the defining feature of Canada's current trade strategy under Carney's direction. Previous diversification efforts were incremental, methodical, and ultimately slow against the gravity of U.S. market pull. Canada's trade dependence on the United States has been relatively sticky over an extended period, during which Canadian government policies tried to diversify trade away from the United States. That stickiness is real. It is the product of geography, language, integrated supply chains, and 3 decades of NAFTA. You do not unwind 30 years of supply chain integration with a few new trade agreements inside 12 months, which is why the Fraser Institute's own analysis noted diversification efforts have had limited impact historically on U.S. dependency. The share of Canadian exports bound for the U.S. declined from 76% in 2024 to 72% in 2025, trending lower. 4 percentage points in 1 year is meaningful, but 72% still represents extraordinary concentration in a single buyer. In October 2025, exports to the U.S. hit 67.3% of all exports, the lowest non-pandemic level since 1997. That October figure is the most telling data point in the entire diversification story unfolding right now. It suggests the decline in U.S. share is accelerating, not just trending gradually downward over a multi-year horizon. Canadian exports to non-U.S. countries rose 30% year over year in recent months, driven mainly by Europe. 30% growth in non-U.S. exports in a single year is not a policy footnote. It is a structural inflection point, and it is happening organically, driven by businesses making rational market decisions, not just government incentives. That 30% surge in non-U.S. exports is real, measurable, and accelerating beyond what most analysts predicted. But the hardest truth about Canada's diversification strategy is sitting inside the optimism right now. Replacing one dominant market with another equally unpredictable one does not reduce risk at all. It merely redistributes it to a different geography with its own set of political and economic variables. And Canada is learning that lesson in real time with China, which seemed like the obvious diversification destination. Only hours before the July 1st CUSMA review began, China announced preliminary duties of 73.5% on Canadian pea starch. That single move targeted one of Canada's most promising new agricultural export streams into the Chinese market. It was a reminder that every major trade relationship carries its own version of the same unpredictability problem. Canada now finds itself simultaneously managing an unpredictable United States and an unpredictable China at once. Canada's relationship with China remains vulnerable to abrupt trade actions, while its relationship with the United States, the destination for roughly 3/4 of merchandise exports, is entering its most uncertain period in years. That double exposure, East and West simultaneously, is the strategic bind Carney inherited and is now actively managing. The January 2026 China canola deal, which cut tariffs from 85% to 15%, was a genuine breakthrough in isolation. But the pea starch duties that followed days before the CUSMA review show Beijing can revoke access as a pressure tool. Trump will use sectoral tariffs on goods such as autos, steel, and aluminum as leverage in endless negotiations, where Washington will seek to divide and conquer Ottawa and Mexico City. Both Washington and Beijing are now using the same playbook against Canada: access as leverage, duties as signals. That reality changes the calculus of Carney's diversification strategy in a fundamental and uncomfortable way. Finding more markets is necessary, but finding reliable markets is the harder and more important objective. Business investment had fallen for the 5th straight month, with Deloitte's report warning that business investment is expected to remain subdued in 2026, with firms largely in a holding pattern as trade uncertainty and the mid-year review of CUSMA weigh on confidence. 3/4 out of 4 have seen the Canadian economy contract since U.S. tariffs hit in earnest. Canada has barely created more jobs than it had 14 months ago, with 2026 net job creation essentially flat so far. Uncertainty surrounding CUSMA is discouraging business investment, making it one of the biggest economic headwinds facing Canada right now. A 16-year CUSMA extension would have provided the long-term certainty businesses need to make capital commitments. Annual reviews, which is now the framework governing the relationship, prolong negotiations and compound business uncertainty. Carney's stated goal is attracting $1 trillion in investment by 2030, and with CUSMA negotiations widely expected to drag well into 2027, that goal faces a significant headwind. Foreign firms considering major Canadian investments are watching the U.S. relationship closely before committing capital. The longer this goes on, the more uncertainty the investment environment gets. Trade analysts told The Hub in June. That uncertainty loop is the real economic threat, not any single tariff line or any one negotiating demand. Canada's push to double non-U.S. trade will not happen by chance, but rather by design, requiring a steady hand during CUSMA renegotiations and a provincial strategy that clears the path for businesses of all sizes to compete globally. The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade made a counterintuitive but correct observation about the path to $600 billion. Paradoxically, the first step toward doubling non-U.S. trade begins with getting CUSMA renegotiations right first. Because a stable continental foundation is what gives Canadian businesses the confidence to simultaneously expand elsewhere. You cannot build outward from a crumbling base. Domestic economic stability is the precondition for global diversification. On April 21, 2026, Carney introduced a newly formed advisory committee on Canada-U.S. relations for direct industry input. Roundtables were held across oil and gas, steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, agriculture, and the automotive sector. That sector-by-sector consultation shows Ottawa understands the diversification challenge is not monolithic. It is industry-specific. An oil sands producer in Alberta cannot pivot to the EU the way a canola farmer can find Japanese buyers. An automaker in Windsor cannot simply redirect its supply chain to Vietnam the way a seafood exporter can find new buyers. Each sector has its own geography of alternatives, its own timeline for pivoting, and its own tolerance for uncertainty. Even small, focused changes in trade policy, how tariff rate quotas are administered, border procedures, government procurement rules, digital measures, can affect Canadian, U.S., and Mexican supply chains, affecting product eligibility, total import costs, contract terms, and documentation. That granularity matters enormously for Canadian businesses that have built compliance systems around CUSMA's current rules. PwC's Canada trade team warned businesses to stress test their supply chains against multiple CUSMA outcome scenarios. That advice, stress test your supply chains, is the private sector's way of saying, expect nothing to be settled soon. Deeply integrated North American supply chains make it difficult and costly to unwind decades of investment across Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and ongoing tariff uncertainty is creating challenges for businesses making long-term capital investment decisions. Canadian companies are being pushed to improve efficiency and pursue opportunities in markets such as Mexico, India, and Europe. And yet, Mexico's position in all of this adds another layer of complexity that Ottawa is watching carefully. The United States has already held 2 formal rounds of bilateral CUSMA talks with Mexico, and a third scheduled for July. Canada and the United States, by contrast, have not held a single formal bilateral CUSMA negotiating session so far. That asymmetry, Mexico in active formal talks, Canada not yet, signals where Washington's priorities are ranked. The challenge for Ottawa and Canadian firms more broadly will be to play defense and offense at the same time. managing an unpredictable and unreliable U.S. while carving out new roles in an increasingly unstable world. That dual mandate, defend the existing relationship while building a new one, is precisely what makes this moment historic. No Canadian government since Confederation has been forced to simultaneously execute both strategies at this speed and scale. Carney visited 26 countries in 1 year. He is building an EU CPTPP coalition. He signed the China canola deal. He formed the Canada-US Advisory Committee. He appointed Janice Charette as chief trade negotiator with Washington. Each move is a piece of a broader architectural redesign of how Canada positions itself in the global economic order. The old architecture, deep U.S. integration as the default setting, everything else is optional, is now formally obsolete. The new architecture, multiple deep relationships, managed simultaneously with no single buyer commanding 73% of exports, is being constructed. And that construction is happening not in a controlled environment, but under live fire from Washington and Beijing at once. Whether Canada succeeds will depend on factors beyond Carney's control. The pace of EU CPTPP talks, China's political calculus, U.S. midterm dynamics. But what is already undeniable is that July 1st, 2026 marked the moment Canada's economic strategy fundamentally and permanently changed direction. The world's longest undefended border is still there. $3.5 billion still crosses it every single day. But the framework that once made that crossing feel permanent, guaranteed, frictionless, and safe is no longer in place. Canada is now building a world where it needs that crossing less, and that is the most consequential shift in decades. If this analysis opened your eyes to what is really happening behind the trade headlines, subscribe to Capital Alert right now. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada can actually hit that $600 billion non-US trade target by 2035?